The crystal broke the same way everything else in that family had broken. Suddenly, and without anyone admitting they had caused it. It had been sitting at the edge of the long mahogany table in the Caldwell dining room, a wine glass that probably cost more than 2 months of Zosia's first rent in Toronto. And then someone laughed too hard at the wrong moment, and an elbow moved and the glass went over the side and shattered on the hardwood floor. Everyone looked at the pieces. No one moved to pick them up. A server appeared from somewhere near the kitchen, within 30 seconds, crouching quietly, gathering the shards into a cloth while the conversation at the table resumed as though the sound had never happened. Zosia Ebe watched the server's hands. She watched the way he worked quickly, and without acknowledgement, the way the people at the table looked past him, as though he were part of the room's infrastructure. She recognized the posture. She had worn it herself once, in a different city, at a different kind of table, wearing different clothes, with a different last name, and a different understanding of what she was allowed to expect from the world. That was a long time ago. She reached for her water glass and said nothing. The Caldwell estate sat outside of Oakville, Ontario, on a property that bordered a conservation area and a private golf course, the kind of land that doesn't get sold anymore, only inherited. The house itself was 4 floors of pale limestone, the kind of architecture that communicates permanence before you ever open the door. Zosia had been coming here for 3 years, once at Christmas, once for a birthday, and now for the annual summer gathering that Gwendolyn Caldwell referred to as the family weekend, and which everyone within a 6-hour radius was expected to attend. Zosia was married to their son. His name was Fletcher. Fletcher Caldwell was 41 years old, third-generation wealth, a man whose ease with expensive things had always read to Zosia as a kind of gentleness, until she understood it was simply the absence of urgency. People who have never had to scramble for anything move through the world at a different speed. She had mistaken his slowness for peace. It had taken her longer than she would ever admit to recognize the difference. She had married him 4 years ago in a ceremony that Gwendolyn had organized and paid for and quietly redesigned from the venue. Zosia had chosen to one she preferred. The flowers were wrong. The menu was wrong. The seating plan had somehow shifted her own sister, a Daisy, to a table near the back. Zosia had noticed this the morning of the wedding, 3 hours before guests arrived, and she had said nothing because she was 20 minutes from walking down an aisle, and because she was in love, and because she told herself that families were complicated and you gave people grace in the beginning. 3 years of these gatherings had taught her that grace offered without condition is not always received as grace. It is sometimes received as permission. The first time Gwendolyn Caldwell said something about Zosia's hair was at Christmas dinner the year they got engaged. She had framed it as a compliment. "I love that you wear it natural," she said, reaching over and touching one of Zosia's coils without asking, the way someone might touch a decorative object on a shelf. "It's so authentic," Zosia had smiled. At the birthday gathering the following spring, a cousin named Beaumont, 47 years old, wore linen blazers without irony, managed a portfolio of something in Calgary, had asked Zosia what she came from. She had said Toronto. He had laughed and said, no, he meant originally. She had said her parents came from Nigeria. He had nodded with the expression of a man receiving information he had already suspected. Beaumont, Fletcher had said. Beaumont had moved on to the cheese board. The following Christmas, Fletcher's sister Harriet had been helping organize seating for the family portrait. There were 17 people staying on the property that year. Zosia was the only one whose position kept being adjusted. She ended up in the outer edge of the second row, partially obscured by the decorative arrangement of evergreen branches someone had placed at the side of the shot. When the photos were sent around on a group thread the following week, Harriet had written, "Gorgeous everyone," with 3 heart emojis. Zosia was not visible in any of the images that were framed. She had not said anything about the piano. She had not said anything about the piano. She had not said anything about a lot of things. What she had done during those years was work. She had always worked. That was the thing about her, the Caldwells didn't know how to account for, and so had learned to quietly minimize. Zosia Ibe, before she became Zosia Caldwell on documents that still felt borrowed, had built a logistics software company in Toronto's East End, starting with a borrowed laptop, a shared co-working desk she paid for by the hour, and a contract from a mid-sized shipping firm that no one else had wanted because the terms were difficult and the timeline was short. She had been 28. She had not eaten well that year. She had worked 16-hour days and learned three things she had never needed to learn before: how to read a procurement contract, how to manage a server migration, and how to make a compelling case to people who would rather not be compelled. The company was called Arroyo Systems. By the time she married Fletcher, it had 47 employees and three major enterprise clients. By the time of the summer gathering in Oakville, it had 212 employees, offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Vancouver, and had recently closed a partnership with one of the largest freight and logistics networks in North America. None of this came up at the Caldwell table. What came up at the Caldwell table was golf and wine vintages, and whether the conservation area would finally be rezoned, and whether Harriet's renovation contractor had overcharged for the millwork. Zosia participated when spoken to, and listened when she wasn't, and had learned, over 3 years, to read the silences in that house the way you read weather, not with alarm, but with a practical attentiveness to what was coming. The summer gathering this year had 31 people on the property. Gwendolyn had arranged the guest list with her usual precision: 2 Caldwell cousins from Halifax, an uncle from Calgary who sat on 3 corporate boards and spoke about each of them with equal authority, a federal member of parliament who had gone to school with Fletcher's father, a retired Superior Court judge named Ambrose, who had been attending these gatherings for longer than some of the guests had been alive. There were family, friends, and neighbors, and the kind of connections that exist in the particular register of old Ontario money. People who know each other from the right schools, and the right clubs, and the cottages that line the same lake. It was the kind of room, Zosia had learned, that held its own codes. And she was fluent in many things, but this particular fluency had never been handed to her. On the Saturday evening, there was a formal dinner. Long table, good silver, a catering team from a firm in Mississauga. Zosia was seated near the middle, which was different from previous years, and which she had noticed and noted without comment. Fletcher was beside her. Gwendolyn was at the head. The dinner was going the way these dinners went, correctly, pleasantly, without emotional weight. And then, at some point during the third course, Beaumont made a joke about the shipping industry that was specifically about companies that had overextended their reach through aggressive acquisition, and he looked at Zosia when he said the punchline. Just for a moment, just long enough. She picked up her fork. Fletcher laughed at the joke. He was looking at the person across from him. The judge, Ambrose, was eating quietly and watching the table with the expression of a man who had spent 40 years listening to people say things they would later regret. Later, and this is the thing about that evening that she had gone over many times afterward, trying to understand the logic of it, the escalation, the precise sequence that had led to the moment. Later, Harriet said something about the company. She said it the way she said most things, lightly, with a smile, as though the lightness were a kind of courtesy. She said that she thought it was lovely that Zosia had her little tech business, and that it must be nice to have something to keep you busy. Zosia put her glass down. Arroyo does about $400 million in annual revenue, she said. It's not a hobby. The table did not go silent, exactly. But it shifted. The conversations in the outer chairs continued. The conversations closer to the center did not. Harriet's smile held. Of course, she said. I just meant. I know what you meant, Zosia said, and her voice was even, and she looked at Harriet with the particular expression of someone who has been keeping a very careful ledger for a very long time. Fletcher touched her arm. She looked at him. Hey, he said quietly. Take it easy. She looked at his hand on her arm. She looked at his face. She thought about the seating chart at their wedding and the photo on the piano, and the Christmas dinner, and the hand in her hair, and 3 years of taking it easy, and she moved her arm away from his hand, not quickly, not dramatically, but clearly, and she picked up her water glass and drank. "You're embarrassing yourself," Fletcher said. Still quietly. Still the way you say something, when you want the person next to you to hear, but not the people across from you. "Fletcher," said the judge, Ambrose. He said it without looking up from his plate. He said it like a period at the end of a sentence. Fletcher looked at him. "Let her speak," the judge said. The table was quiet now. Gwendolyn Caldwell set down her fork with a precision that communicated everything she had not said. "This is a family dinner," she said. "I would prefer if we—" "She is family," said the MP, whose name was Colm, and who had been quiet for most of the evening, and was now looking at Gwendolyn with the expression of a man who had decided to stop being quiet. "She has been family for 4 years, Gwendolyn." Fletcher stood up. He stood up and he looked at Zosia, and he said, in the particular register of someone whose anger has been waiting for permission, "You want to do this here? In front of everyone?" She had been in this room before. Not this exact room, not this exact dinner, but this room, the one where she was expected to manage not only her own emotion but everyone else's comfort, simultaneously, while her husband's family watched to see which way she would fold. She had been in this room for 3 years. She had been preparing for this room, in some sense, since she was a girl in Scarborough, watching her mother work 2 jobs and smile at people who did not smile back. "Sit down, Fletcher," she said. He didn't sit down. What he did, and this was the thing that Ambrose would later describe, in his statement to the police, as deliberate and unambiguous, was reach across the space between them and push her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her from the chair. Hard enough to make clear that he had decided her body was something he was entitled to direct. The room went completely still. Harriet made a sound that was not a word. Gwendolyn's hand was flat on the table. The MP, Colm, was already getting to his feet. Zosia sat very still for 1 moment, 2. The way you sit, when something has happened that rearranges everything and you are giving your nervous system a moment to catch up to the fact of it. Then she stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not say a great many things. What she said was, "Do not touch me again." And then she walked toward the doors that led out to the terrace, and the sound of her shoes on the stone floor was the loudest sound in the room. She stood on the terrace for a long time. The conservation area was dark beyond the property's edge lighting. Something moved in the trees. A server came out 20 minutes later and asked if she needed anything, and she asked for a glass of water, and the server brought it, and they stood in companionable silence for a moment before he went back inside. Inside, she would later learn, the dinner had not resumed. Colm had called the non-emergency line and spoken to someone. Ambrose had written something in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket. One of the Halifax cousins had quietly left the table and gone upstairs and had not come back down. Harriet had said several things that no one had agreed with. Gwendolyn had said one thing once that cleared the room. She had said, "He's my son." Ambrose had responded, "He's also an adult who put his hands on his wife in front of a sitting member of parliament and a former superior court judge. I would encourage you to think about what that means." Zosia did not know any of this yet. She was standing on the terrace with her water glass, watching the dark edge of the conservation area, recalculating. She had a phone call to return. She had been putting it off since before dinner because it was the kind of call she knew would take focus, and she had not wanted to have it while thinking about seating arrangements and Beaumont's jokes. She took out her phone now. The call was from her VP of Communications, a woman named Solane, who had been with Arroyo since year 3 and who had the particular quality of someone who only calls after business hours when something important has happened. Zosia called her back. "The BNN Bloomberg piece dropped early," Solane said. "They moved it to the Friday evening slot. It ran 20 minutes ago." Zosia was quiet. "It's the full profile," Solane said. "They used the warehouse segment and the North America partnership announcement and the childhood piece." It's very good," It's the lead segment of the program. Inside the house, at some point during the next 10 minutes, someone turned on the television in the large sitting room off the main hall. It was the kind of house with many televisions, and someone had turned on the one in the sitting room, probably to fill the silence that had settled over the property since the dinner had stopped being a dinner. The program that came on was a business news broadcast. Zosia did not know this yet. She was still on the phone with Solean, listening to a summary of the segment that had aired. The profile that BNN Bloomberg had been preparing for 4 months. The one that had taken her 2 full days of filming in Toronto and one morning in the Scarborough neighborhood where she had grown up. The piece that was about Arroyo's North American expansion, but had become, in the editing, something larger, something about what it costs to build something from nothing, and what it looks like when someone does it anyway. The segment had used her full name, her photograph, the name of the company, and its valuation. Inside the Caldwell house, in the sitting room off the main hall, the profile played on the television screen. The anchor introduced aerial footage of the Toronto office. There was her photograph, large, on the screen. Knock, the sculling. There was her name in the lower third, white letters on a dark background, and below her name, in smaller text, the words, Founder and CEO, Arroyo Systems. Net worth estimated at $1.4 billion. She did not know who was in the sitting room when it played. She would learn, later, that it was most of them, that the strange gravity of what had happened at dinner had pulled people into that room without anyone organizing it. Ambrose was there. Colm was there. The Calgary uncle was there. Several of the cousins. Harriet. Gwendolyn was there. Fletcher was there. She finished her call with Celine and stood for another few minutes on the terrace. The night was warm and smelled like cedar and cut grass. A light had come on in one of the upstairs windows. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the television. She went back inside. The sitting room was off to the left of the main hall, and she could see it from the doorway, the group of people standing and sitting with an attention that was different from the attention of a moment ago, the particular stillness of people recalibrating. The television was on. She could see herself on the screen, talking in the segment she had filmed in the Scarborough kitchen of the apartment where she had lived until she was 12. On Batriskamar, Vidranch, she stood in the doorway. Gwendolyn Caldwell was sitting in the large chair by the window, the one she always sat in, the one that faced the room. Her expression was the expression of someone experiencing a shift in a tectonic plate, something that has moved underneath the known surface, without warning, without permission, without regard for what had been built on top of it. Fletcher was standing to one side, not looking at the television, looking at Zosia. His expression was more difficult to read. She had spent 4 years learning to read it, and she still wasn't sure, looking at him in that doorway, whether what she was seeing was shame or the beginning of a calculation about how to manage what shame might require. Zosia, he said. I'm going to make a phone call, she said, and then I need to speak with you. She made the phone call from the guest room where they had been staying. It was to her own lawyer, a woman in Toronto, who had been telling Zosia for 18 months that she should have this number memorized, and who answered on the third ring despite the hour with the directness of someone who had been expecting this call as well. She spoke for 12 minutes. She asked 3 questions. She received 3 answers, and the answers were clear, and she felt something settle in her chest that had not been settled for a long time. Downstairs, Colm the MP had followed through on his earlier call, and the on-duty officer, who arrived 40 minutes later, was professional and thorough and spoke to Ambrose first, then to the catering staff, then to several of the guests. Fletcher, in the end, spoke to the officer in the library, with the door mostly open, and the conversation was brief. And when it was over, the officer asked him to remain available and said there would be a follow-up in the coming days. Gwendolyn said nothing. For the first time in 3 years of these gatherings, the night ended the way nights end when the thing that has been held together begins to come apart, not with shouting, but with a long specific quiet, the kind that settles after the truth has been said in a room and no one has found a way to unsay it. The following morning, Zosia had breakfast on the terrace. She had eggs and coffee, and the edition of the Globe that the house had delivered, and she read it the way she had always read things. Carefully, with attention to what was between the lines as much as what was in them. Harriet came out at some point, stood at the terrace door for a moment, and then went back inside without saying anything. The Calgary uncle walked past on his way to the car, carrying his own bag, and stopped and said, "I've heard about Arroyo for 2 years, and didn't put it together. That was a hell of a profile." He said it with the awkward directness of someone trying to retrofit respect and not quite managing the angle. She nodded and he left. Fletcher came out just before 10. He looked like a man who had slept poorly, which she thought was probably accurate. He sat down across from her and put his hands on the table. "I want to apologize," he said. She looked at him. "I don't know what happened last night," he said. "I do," she said. "I watched it happen for 3 years." He was quiet. "The things your family said to me," she said. "The seating, the photos. The way your sister spoke about my company last night. The way you laughed at Beaumont's joke and then touched my arm and told me to take it easy." She said it plainly, without emotion, the way she had said many things in her professional life, the way you say a thing clearly when you need the other person to understand that you have been keeping very careful records. "I want you to understand that none of that was small to me. None of it." "I know," he said. "I'm not sure you do," she said, "but I think you're going to have to learn." She poured herself more coffee. The conservation area was green and still in the morning light. A pair of geese crossed the far edge of the lawn with the particular confidence of animals who have decided they live there now. "I spoke to my lawyer last night," she said. He looked up. "I'm not telling you that as a threat," she said. "I'm telling you because I think we need to be honest with each other, possibly for the first time in a while, about what this marriage has actually been like for one of us." She set the coffee down. "And I think we both know which one." He did not argue with that. She gave him credit for not arguing with that. The legal process that followed was neither fast nor simple. These things never are. There were conversations and lawyers, and a period of 6 weeks where she stayed in her own apartment in Toronto and went to work every day and did the thing she had always done, which was to keep building the thing she had built, because the world had made very clear from the beginning that no one was going to build it for her. The officer who had come to the house filed a report. Fletcher, through his lawyer, accepted a conditional discharge and completed a program. He never contested the process. That was, she thought, maybe the most honest thing he had done. The BNN Bloomberg segment was picked up by 3 national outlets and 1 American business publication. Arroyo's inquiry line received 214 new partnership requests in the 6 weeks following the broadcast. Solene handled all of them with great efficiency and only a small amount of visible delight. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in October, which is a very ordinary day for something that ends 4 years of your life, and Zosia signed the documents in her lawyer's office on King Street and walked out into the cold afternoon air and took the streetcar home because she had always preferred the streetcar, even now, even with everything. Her mother called that evening. Her mother, who had worked 2 jobs and smiled at people who did not smile back, and who had told Zosia, when she was 9 years old in their kitchen in Scarborough, that the most important thing you can own is the thing no one can take away from you. "How are you?" her mother asked. "Good," Zosia said. And then, because her mother had always been able to tell, "Really good, Mama, I promise." Outside, Toronto was doing what it does in October, cold and direct and not particularly interested in being apologized to. The lake was gray and enormous in the distance. Somewhere in the East End, in a building she had paid for herself, 212 people were working on something that was hers. She made tea. She sat by the window. She thought about the crystal glass on the Caldwell floor, and the server's careful hands gathering the pieces, and the way the table had moved on as though nothing had broken. Everything breaks eventually, she thought. The question is only who gets to decide what gets rebuilt.